Imagine a kingdom that stood united for over 1,000 years. Its mountains and valleys belonged to a single people, sharing one language, one history, and one deep identity. Then, in a single night, two tired military men in a distant room draw a line across a map. With the stroke of a pen, they tear that ancient nation in half, creating a wound that remains unhealed to this very day. Welcome to the story of North Korea. This is a journey into how a temporary border became the most permanent scar on the modern map. We will trace the origins of a secretive state, explore the tragic division of a people, and understand how global diplomacy, devastating wars, and modern summits shaped a nation that stands alone. To understand the North Korea of today, we must first travel back to a time before the country even existed. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Korean peninsula was an undivided land, but it was surrounded by powerful, expanding empires. In the year 1910, the Empire of Japan crossed the sea and swallowed Korea whole. Listen for this word: annex. In historical English, when a powerful country formally and legally takes over another country's territory by force, we say they annex it. Japan annexed Korea in 1910. For 35 years, the Korean people endured a brutal colonial occupation. The Japanese Empire sought to completely erase Korean identity. Schools were forced to teach only in Japanese. Korean families were pressured to adopt Japanese surnames. Farmers worked the fields, but the rice they grew was shipped overseas to feed the Japanese military. Just like a biological infection enters a human body and rewrites its cellular instructions, an occupying empire attempts to rewrite the culture of its host. The foreign presence infects the daily routines of the people, suppressing their native language and replacing their history with the occupier's propaganda. But a culture is a resilient, living organism. Beneath the surface of Japanese control, Korean resistance fighters kept their identity alive. Many fled across the northern border into the snowy landscapes of Manchuria and the Soviet Union, forming secret guerrilla groups to fight back against the empire. For decades, liberation seemed impossible. But suddenly, the world shifted. In August 1945, the Second World War came to a violently abrupt end. 2 atomic bombs fell on Japan, breaking the empire's grip. On the streets of Seoul and Pyongyang, millions of Koreans wept with joy, pouring into the streets, waving hidden Korean flags. In English, we use the word liberation to describe this exact moment. Liberation is the act of setting someone free from imprisonment, slavery, or foreign oppression. The Korean people believed their long nightmare was finally over. They believed they were masters of their own destiny once again. But freedom was a ghost. While Koreans celebrated, a strange and accidental twist of history was unfolding in Washington, D.C. It was late at night on August 10, 1945. The United States government suddenly realized that Soviet troops, who had just declared war on Japan days earlier, were rapidly marching down the Korean peninsula from the north. The Americans were thousands of miles away. They needed a way to divide the surrender of Japanese troops between the Soviet Union and the United States before the Soviets took the entire peninsula. 2 young American officers, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were given 30 minutes to solve the problem. They went into a small room. They did not have experts on Korean history. They did not even have a proper military map. They looked at a small map from a National Geographic magazine. Their eyes scanned the peninsula. They needed a line that would give the capital city, Seoul, to the Americans, while leaving the northern half to the Soviets. They spotted a line of latitude, the 38th parallel. Notice the phrase, arbitrary boundary. In English, when a decision is made randomly, based on convenience rather than deep reasoning or natural borders, we call it arbitrary. The 38th parallel was an entirely arbitrary boundary. It ignored mountains, rivers, and the locations of ancient villages. It was simply a mathematical line on a piece of paper. The Americans proposed this line to the Soviet Union. To their surprise, the Soviet leadership accepted. Think of that arbitrary line like a tourniquet wrapped tightly around a living human limb. A tourniquet stops blood flow in an emergency. But if left on too long, the circulation stops completely. The tissue begins to starve, and eventually, the limb is lost forever. Society requires circulation to survive. The free flow of families visiting each other, goods moving to markets, and ideas traveling between cities. When the 38th parallel was drawn, that circulation was instantly cut off. In the north, Soviet troops established a military administration. In the south, American forces did the same. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement to handle the surrender of Japanese soldiers quickly hardened into a wall of suspicion. The Cold War had begun, and the Korean peninsula was caught directly in the middle. The ancient kingdom was now two halves of a global geopolitical chessboard. The people in the northern half found themselves under a new kind of foreign control. They were promised a workers' paradise, but they were cut off from their brothers and sisters in the south. The Soviet military commanders needed a Korean leader to manage their new territory. They needed someone who had fought the Japanese, someone who was loyal to communist ideals, and most importantly, someone they believed they could control. Why did the Soviets feel the need to install a relatively unknown guerrilla fighter instead of an established politician? And how would this one man take an arbitrary line on a map and use it to build the most isolated nation on Earth? In the autumn of 1945, the Soviet military searched for a face to put on their newly occupied territory in northern Korea. They did not want an ancient king, and they did not want an independent, stubborn politician. They wanted a symbol, someone who looked like a true Korean patriot, but who would quietly take orders from Moscow. They found their answer in a 33-year-old resistance fighter. On October 14, 1945, tens of thousands of citizens gathered in a massive outdoor stadium in Pyongyang. They had come to celebrate their sudden liberation from Japanese rule. The Soviet commanding general stood before the cheering crowd and introduced a man he called a great national hero. Out stepped a young, slightly chubby man. Historical accounts suggest he was wearing a borrowed, poorly fitting Soviet civilian suit. He looked out over the sea of eager faces, cleared his throat, and began to read a prepared speech. His birth name was Kim Song-ju, but the people of Korea knew him by the legendary name he had adopted in the snowy, unforgiving forests of Manchuria: Kim Il-sung. Listen for this phrase: guerrilla warfare. In historical English, this refers to small, independent groups of fighters using surprise attacks, sabotage, and rapid movement against a larger, traditional army. For years, Kim Il-sung had practiced guerrilla warfare against the Japanese Empire. He was brave, surviving harsh winters and constant ambushes. Eventually, hunted and exhausted, he was forced to retreat across the border into the Soviet Union, where he was trained as a captain in the Soviet Red Army. Because of his military training in Russia, the Soviet leadership believed he would be a perfect, obedient partner. They thought of him as a figurehead. Notice this word, figurehead. A figurehead is a leader who holds an impressive title and stands in front of the crowds, but actually possesses no real power. The strings are pulled by someone else hidden behind the curtain. But society, much like biology, rarely behaves exactly as an outsider predicts. Think of a gardener performing a biological graft, taking a branch from one tree and attaching it to the trunk of another. The gardener, in this case the Soviet Union, cut into the ancient roots of Korean society and grafted a foreign political branch onto it, Soviet communism. The Soviets fully expected this new branch to grow exactly as it did in Moscow, producing a standard, predictable satellite state. However, living organisms always adapt to their local environment. The Korean soil was deeply influenced by centuries of absolute kings, royal bloodlines, and strict Confucian social hierarchies. When the foreign branch of communism absorbed these ancient cultural nutrients, it mutated. It did not grow into a standard European communist state. Instead, it slowly transformed into a unique, fiercely independent, and tightly controlled organism, custom-built for its ruler. Kim Il-sung was incredibly patient, and he was absolutely no mere figurehead. With quiet, ruthless efficiency, he began eliminating his political rivals. He used Soviet support to establish a powerful military and a secret police force. When a human body detects a foreign virus, the immune system rapidly isolates and destroys the threat. In the new North Korean state, the secret police acted as this ruthless political immune system. Anyone who opposed Kim's vision was treated as an infection. This brings us to another valuable word, dissident. In English, a dissident is a person who actively and publicly opposes the official policies of an authoritarian state. Dissidents were not tolerated in Kim's new nation. Wealthy landowners, religious leaders, and political rivals were labeled as enemies of the people. They either vanished in the middle of the night or fled in terror across the southern border. By 1948, the arbitrary line drawn by two American officers on a National Geographic map had hardened into a wall of concrete, ideology, and barbed wire. The United Nations attempted to hold peninsula-wide elections to reunite the country, but the North refused to participate. In the South, the Republic of Korea was officially born, backed by the United States. In response, just 3 weeks later, Kim Il-sung stood in Pyongyang and declared the establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, completely backed by the Soviet Union. To secure total control, Kim began to rewrite his own history. Pay attention to this essential historical term, cult of personality. A cult of personality occurs when a leader uses mass media, relentless propaganda, and the arts to create an idealized, heroic, and almost godlike public image. The state began to vastly exaggerate Kim's role in defeating the Japanese. Paintings depicted him as a brilliant, flawless father figure. Citizens were taught to thank him for their food, their homes, and their very existence. The temporary division of Korea was now a permanent reality, but Kim Il-sung refused to accept it. He looked across the 38th parallel with burning, restless ambition. He did not want to rule half a country. He wanted to sit on the throne of a fully united Korean peninsula. The boy who fought the Japanese in the bitter snow had become the absolute ruler of the North. The Soviets thought they had installed a loyal servant, but the servant was already planning a massive, bloody gamble to rewrite the map by force. To do it, he just needed a mechanized army, and he needed Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to finally say yes. How did a localized border dispute explode into one of the most destructive global conflicts of the 20th century? And what happens to a society when the sky itself rains fire for 3 long years? It is the early hours of June 25th, 1950. Monsoon rains fall softly on the sleepy farming villages along the 38th parallel. But the heavy thunder rolling across the hills is not from the sky. It is the sound of war. Without warning, thousands of North Korean artillery shells shatter the Sunday morning silence. The invasion begins. Hundreds of heavily armored, Soviet-built tanks crash through the border fences, crushing everything in their path. Kim Il-sung's army sweeps southward like a violent flood. Within just 3 days, the southern capital of Seoul falls into North Korean hands. Kim Il-sung genuinely believed his massive gamble had paid off. For months, he had secretly lobbied Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and Chinese leader Mao Zedong, promising a quick, painless victory. He assured them the South Korean people would rise up and welcome him as a liberator. They did not. Instead, the sudden invasion triggered one of the most rapid and devastating military responses in modern history. The United Nations, led by the United States, rushed troops across the ocean to save the South from collapse. Listen for this term: counteroffensive. In historical English, a counteroffensive is a large-scale military attack made by a defending force to push back and defeat an enemy's advance. The American and United Nations forces launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing the North Korean army all the way back across the 38th parallel. They did not stop at the border. The UN forces marched deep into North Korean territory, pushing all the way to the icy Yalu River, right on the edge of China. Kim Il-sung's dream of total victory had suddenly turned into a nightmare of total defeat. His government was forced to flee into the mountains. But the war was about to mutate again. Fearing an American army right on its doorstep, Communist China sent hundreds of thousands of troops pouring across the frozen Yalu River in the dead of winter. Bugles echoed in the freezing night air as human waves of Chinese soldiers crashed into the American lines. The fighting was incredibly brutal, fought in sub-zero temperatures where weapons froze, and men perished from the extreme cold as much as from bullets. This brings us to an important word: stalemate. A stalemate is a situation in a contest or conflict where neither side can make any progress, and winning becomes completely impossible. After a year of wild, rapidly shifting front lines, the conflict froze into a bloody, grinding stalemate, right back where it started, near the 38th parallel. When a human body fights a severe, prolonged fever, the immune system burns an enormous amount of energy, often damaging the body's own vital organs in the desperate effort to survive. The Korean War was a catastrophic fever that consumed the entire peninsula. To break the stalemate, the United States military unleashed a relentless, crushing bombing campaign from the sky over North Korea. Pay attention to this phrase, scorched earth. In military history, a scorched earth policy involves intentionally destroying crops, bridges, factories, and entire cities so the enemy cannot use them. The bombing of North Korea was an extreme, devastating example of this strategy. American bombers dropped more explosives on the Korean peninsula than were used in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. The capital, Pyongyang, was reduced to ash and rubble. By the end of the war, historians estimate that 85% of all buildings in North Korea were completely destroyed. Citizens were forced to live like moles, moving schools, hospitals, and weapons factories deep underground into mountain caves to survive the daily rain of fire. An estimated 3 million Korean civilians from both the North and the South lost their lives. The trauma of this relentless destruction fundamentally rewired the psychology of the North Korean state. To this day, the government uses the terrifying memory of those bombers to justify its extreme militarization. In the dark, smoke-filled bunkers during the final months of the war, Kim Il-sung was already planning his political survival. He needed a scapegoat. A scapegoat is a person who is unfairly blamed for the wrongdoings, mistakes, or faults of others. Kim brilliantly and ruthlessly shifted the blame for the war's failure onto his political rivals within the Communist Party. He accused them of being American spies and traitors. In rapid succession, they were arrested, subjected to show trials, and executed. The biological immune system of his regime was attacking its own cells to preserve the brain. By the time the fighting paused, there was no one left to challenge him. Finally, on July 27, 1953, the guns fell silent. But notice this crucial historical distinction. The fighting ended with an armistice. An armistice is a formal agreement between warring parties to stop fighting. It is a temporary ceasefire, not a permanent peace treaty. Because no official peace treaty was ever signed, North and South Korea remain legally at war to this very day. The original arbitrary line had become a permanent fortress of landmines, guard towers, and barbed wire, known as the demilitarized zone. Millions of families were permanently separated. Kim Il-sung had started a war that completely destroyed his own country. In any normal society, such a catastrophic failure would lead to the immediate downfall of its leader. But Kim did not fall. Instead, he used the absolute destruction of his country to tighten his grip on power even further. How did a leader survive a completely failed war? And what strange new philosophy would he invent to convince his people that they did not need the outside world at all? When the sirens finally stopped wailing in the summer of 1953, the survivors climbed out of the dark, damp mountain caves. They blinked against the bright sunlight, looking down at a capital city that simply no longer existed. Pyongyang was a vast, silent landscape of ash and jagged craters. Historians note that only a handful of modern buildings remained standing in the entire city. The air smelled of burnt wood and pulverized concrete. Yet, instead of surrendering to despair, the government immediately ordered the exhausted people to start digging. Men, women, and children cleared the heavy rubble with their bare hands. They rebuilt their homes, weapons factories, and grand monuments at a punishing breakneck speed. Listen for this phrase, breakneck speed. In English, When something is done dangerously fast, almost out of control, we call it breakneck speed. The post-war reconstruction of North Korea moved at breakneck speed. To motivate the population, the state launched a massive labor campaign named after a mythical winged horse that could run 1,000 leagues in a single day. The government broadcasted patriotic music through loudspeakers on street corners, commanding the people to work with the tireless spirit of that flying horse. But how does a leader actually survive a war that destroys his own country? He changes the story. Kim Il-sung did not admit defeat. He boldly declared that surviving the American bombing was, in fact, a glorious military victory. He convinced his people that the outside world was a hostile, predatory place, and that only his brilliant leadership could protect them from complete annihilation. Think of a biological organism that has barely survived a near-fatal attack. The intense trauma completely rewires its nervous system. To avoid being hurt again, the organism grows a thick, impenetrable shell. It cuts itself off from the unpredictable outside environment. North Korea did exactly the same thing. The trauma of the war became the psychological shell that protected the regime. However, to justify this new, permanent isolation, Kim Il-sung needed a powerful new philosophy. He could not rely purely on Soviet communism because he did not want to be a puppet of Moscow forever. Furthermore, a bitter rivalry was erupting between the Soviet Union and China. Both empires demanded his loyalty. Kim needed a way to play them against each other without becoming a servant to either. In December 1955, he delivered a speech introducing a concept that would define the nation's identity forever. This brings us to a crucial historical word, Juche. In the Korean language, Juche translates roughly to self-reliance or self-determination. But as a political ideology, it means much more. Juche is the official state ideology of North Korea. It teaches that man is the master of his own destiny, and therefore the North Korean nation must be completely independent in politics, economics, and military defense. Under the banner of Juche, the country was taught to reject foreign influence. They would grow their own food, manufacture their own tractors, and forge their own cultural path. It sounded like a proud, noble idea to a deeply traumatized people. But in reality, Juche was an elegant trap. Pay attention to this word, indoctrination. Indoctrination is the process of repeating an idea or belief to a person until they accept it completely, without any criticism or question. Juche was not just a philosophy. It was a daily tool for total indoctrination. Every song on the radio, every mathematics school book, and every theatrical performance repeated the exact same message. The outside world is evil, and only the great leader can keep you safe. It worked perfectly. By the 1960s, behind its iron shell, North Korea was actually growing economically faster than South Korea. Factories were humming. The shell was hardening. Kim Il-sung elevated himself from a successful guerrilla fighter to a living deity. He began to cultivate his image with absolute control. Listen for the word cultivate. When a farmer meticulously prepares and cares for crops, they cultivate the land. When a leader deliberately builds and controls a specific public image over a long period of time, they cultivate that image. Kim cultivated an image of a benevolent, all-knowing father. Every citizen was required to wear a small red pin bearing his portrait over their heart. We have seen how Kim Il-sung used the absolute devastation of war to build a fortress of self-reliance around his people. The concept of Juche allowed him to cut the strings of foreign control and build an isolated, fiercely loyal society. The shared trauma of the bombing made the people willing to accept this closed, strictly monitored world. But there is a fatal, unavoidable flaw in the biology of isolation. A creature locked inside a shell cannot survive if the environment outside drastically changes. What happens to a nation built entirely on the strict promise of self-reliance when the soil turns dry, the crops fail, and the food simply runs out? And how does a completely closed system react when the very global empires that secretly helped build it suddenly collapse overnight? It is the dead of night in the late 1980s. A heavy freight train rumbles across a cold steel bridge connecting the Soviet Union to North Korea. What is hidden inside those rattling, unmarked train cars is the greatest state secret of all: the absolute failure of their own founding philosophy. For decades, the government relentlessly preached Juche, the grand ideology of pure self-reliance. The people were taught that they needed nothing from the outside world. But the reality was a carefully constructed, dangerous lie. Behind closed doors, North Korea's factories, farms, and military were deeply dependent on cheap, heavily discounted oil and machinery from their giant communist neighbor. Listen for this word: subsidize. In English, to subsidize means to financially support an activity or an entire industry so that prices remain artificially low. The Soviet Empire heavily subsidized the North Korean economy for nearly half a century. Kim Il-sung used these quiet Soviet subsidies to build massive concrete monuments, keep his sprawling military strong, and maintain the illusion of a flawless workers' paradise. He built grand avenues in Pyongyang and handed out regular, guaranteed food rations to every citizen. To the isolated people, their great leader was magically providing everything they needed. Notice this valuable word: facade. A facade is the impressive, decorative front of a grand building. However, in historical English, it also describes a deceptive outward appearance that hides a much darker, fragile reality. North Korea's apparent wealth and stability was a crumbling facade. Imagine a strange, exotic plant that claims to grow entirely on its own in the harsh desert. It stands tall and green, ignoring the drought. But deep underground, hidden from view, a metal pipe secretly pumps water directly to its roots. If someone suddenly turns off that valve, the plant will not just wilt, it will violently wither and collapse in the sun. In 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union, the grand empire of communism, collapsed overnight. The hidden water pipe was suddenly and violently turned off. The new capitalist Russian government looked at North Korea and completely changed the rules. They announced that they would no longer subsidize the isolated nation. From that day forward, if North Korea wanted oil, machinery, or fertilizer, they had to pay for it immediately. Pay attention to this specific term: hard currency. In international economics, hard currency refers to a globally trusted, stable form of money. The Russians demanded payment in hard currency, but North Korea had isolated itself for so long that it had almost zero international trade. They had no hard currency, only their own worthless domestic money. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The oil simply stopped flowing across the bridge. Without oil, the power plants went dark. Without electricity, the massive chemical factories that produced agricultural fertilizer were forced to shut down. The soil in North Korea is naturally rocky and poor. It desperately required that chemical fertilizer to grow rice and corn. Without it, the overworked land essentially died. Out in the fields, the Soviet-built tractors ran out of fuel and sat rusting in the freezing mud. This is what engineers and historians call a cascading failure. Listen to the phrase carefully. A cascading failure is a terrifying process where the breakdown of one small, critical part triggers the failure of the next part until an entire, massive system completely collapses. No foreign oil meant no electricity. No electricity meant no fertilizer. No fertilizer meant no crops. And no crops meant no food. The biological bloodstream of the nation, the state rationing system that fed every single citizen, began to run dry. People waited in long, quiet lines for grain that simply never arrived. Hunger began to creep into the distant northern villages, a silent predator stalking a trapped population. Then, history delivered a final, devastating blow. In the summer of 1994, as the food crisis rapidly deepened, the immortal father of the nation, Kim Il-sung, suffered a sudden heart attack and died. He was 82 years old. The psychological shock to the nation was absolute. The entire country plunged into genuine, hysterical grief. Millions of citizens poured into the streets of Pyongyang in the pouring rain. They wept uncontrollably, beating the wet ground with their fists in pure despair. They had been taught since childhood that he was a god, a protector who could control the weather and keep the wolves at bay. Now they had lost their father, just as the sky was falling. We have seen how the proud illusion of total self-reliance hid a fatal dependency, and how the sudden collapse of a foreign empire triggered a domestic nightmare. The nation was now starving, bankrupt, and grieving. The throne of the isolated kingdom was passed to Kim's son, an eccentric and untested man named Kim Jong-il. How does a new leader keep absolute control of 20 million people when there is no food left to feed them? And what terrifying new weapon would he decide to build to ensure the world could never ignore his starving, crumbling kingdom? The trains stopped moving. The giant steel factories went completely silent. And then, the heavy rains began to fall. In the summer of 1995, just a year after the death of the nation's founding father, the skies over North Korea opened up. Massive, unprecedented floods swept across the already fragile, overworked landscape. Raging waters tore through the valleys, drowning the remaining coal mines and washing away an estimated 15% of the country's precious, arable farmland. The carefully constructed facade of the state had already cracked when foreign Soviet subsidies vanished. Now, nature itself was washing the remaining pieces away. With the harvest destroyed, the government's food distribution system collapsed. Millions of citizens who had relied entirely on the state for their daily bowls of rice and corn were suddenly left with absolutely nothing. Listen for this word: famine. In historical English, a famine is an extreme, severe, and widespread shortage of food that causes mass starvation and death across an entire region. What unfolded in North Korea during the mid to late 1990s was a devastating famine. The government, refusing to admit structural failure, gave it a heroic-sounding name, the Arduous March. They told the people they were simply enduring a tough, temporary journey, just as their leaders had done during the anti-Japanese guerrilla wars. But the reality in the northern provinces was an absolute nightmare. Families survived by foraging in the mountains. They stripped the inner bark off pine trees, pounding it into a bitter, hard-to-digest paste to fill their empty stomachs. They hunted for wild roots, frogs, and weeds. In the silent, empty train stations, orphaned children gathered, desperately searching the dirt for a single dropped kernel of corn. Historians and demographers debate the exact numbers, but evidence suggests that between hundreds of thousands to over 2 million people perished from starvation and related diseases during this dark period. Think of a human body suffering from severe hypothermia or freezing temperatures. To survive, the brain sends an emergency signal to restrict blood flow to the fingers and toes. It sacrifices the extremities to keep the vital organs, the heart, the lungs, and the brain, warm and functioning. The new leader, Kim Jong-il, applied this exact biological survival mechanism to his dying nation. He had a terrifying choice to make: open the borders and beg the outside world for help, which would risk losing his absolute power, or sacrifice the extremities of his society to save the core of his regime. He chose the regime. He chose the military. Notice this phrase, military first. In the Korean language, this policy is officially known as Songun. Kim Jong-il elevated the military to the absolute highest position in the country, placing them above the workers, the teachers, and the farmers. He ensured that whatever little food and fuel remained was sent directly to the army. The soldiers had to be fed because the soldiers were the only ones keeping the ruling family on the throne. As the state rationing system crumbled, a profound psychological shift occurred in the minds of the ordinary people. For the first time, they realized the government could not save them. To survive, they had to break the law. Pay attention to this term, black market. A black market is a hidden, illegal system of buying and selling goods that are highly controlled or banned by the government. In the shadows of the famine, small black markets began to sprout up in every single town. Desperate women crossed the freezing shallow rivers into China at night, smuggling back cheap rice, basic medicine, and batteries to sell for a profit. The absolute grip of the state was slowly slipping, replaced by the desperate, quiet hum of illegal capitalism. The people were learning to survive on their own. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-il looked out at an aggressive, rapidly changing world. The United States had recently demonstrated its overwhelming military power in the Middle East. Kim knew his own conventional army, though massive in numbers, was running out of gas and flying obsolete Soviet fighter jets. He realized that a massive standing army was no longer enough to guarantee his survival against modern empires. He needed a shortcut. He needed an ultimate shield that would make foreign powers too terrified to ever attack him, no matter how weak his domestic economy became. This brings us to a crucial English concept: deterrent. A deterrent is a terrifying weapon or a severe threat designed specifically to stop an enemy from attacking, out of fear of the devastating consequences. Kim Jong-il decided to pour the last remaining wealth and scientific resources of his starving nation into building the ultimate deterrent. He vastly accelerated a highly secret, underground program to build a nuclear bomb. The logic was brutally simple. If he possessed a nuclear weapon, the United States could never invade him, and he could use the threat of a nuclear strike to force the world to pay attention. Diplomacy would become a game of high-stakes extortion. We have seen how a closed society reacts when the food runs out. The catastrophic famine broke the long-standing social contract between the state and the people, forcing ordinary citizens into the shadows of the black market just to stay alive. To survive the collapse, the leadership sacrificed its own citizens to feed the army and turned its eyes toward the dark, destructive power of the atom. But building a nuclear weapon in total isolation is nearly impossible. You need massive amounts of money, you need highly enriched materials, and you need time. How do you buy time when the world's greatest superpower is watching your every move? And what happens when the very first international nuclear deal is placed on the negotiating table? Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains of North Korea, completely hidden from the sharp eyes of foreign satellite cameras, deadly new machines began to spin. But above ground, in the polite, brightly lit cities of Europe, the isolated government was putting on a very different show. It is October 1994, in the quiet, diplomatic city of Geneva, Switzerland. American and North Korean diplomats sit across from each other at a long wooden table. They are about to sign a piece of paper that the United States believes will finally solve the terrifying crisis on the Korean peninsula. Listen for this phrase, nuclear deal. In historical English, a nuclear deal is a formal, highly complex agreement between nations to limit, control, or completely eliminate the production of nuclear weapons. This specific agreement was known as the Agreed Framework. Under this nuclear deal, North Korea promised to freeze and eventually dismantle its illegal plutonium weapons program. In exchange, the United States, South Korea, and Japan agreed to send massive shipments of heavy heating oil and build 2 safe civilian nuclear reactors to help solve the North's desperate energy crisis. For the outside world, the crisis seemed over. The Americans exhaled in relief. But the spinning machines in the dark mountains never actually stopped. Think of a biological survival strategy found deep in the rainforest. Certain small frogs and insects are physically weak and highly vulnerable to larger predators. To survive, they evolved to display incredibly bright, terrifying colors. This brilliant mimicry tricks the predator into believing the tiny frog is highly venomous and dangerous to eat. Kim Jong-il was applying this exact evolutionary strategy to global politics. His nation was starving, freezing, and economically shattered. The old, proud promise of Juche, pure self-reliance, had completely failed. So, to ensure his regime was never attacked by the massive American military, he needed to display bright, terrifying colors to the world. He needed the world to believe he was dangerous, unpredictable, and perfectly willing to start a catastrophic war. Notice this crucial historical term, brinkmanship. In political English, brinkmanship is the incredibly dangerous practice of pushing a conflict to the absolute edge of disaster in order to force your opponent to back down and give you what you want. Kim Jong-il became a master of brinkmanship. He realized that a starving, quiet nation would simply be ignored by the global empires. But a starving nation that constantly threatened to vaporize its neighbors would receive endless attention, diplomatic visits, and most importantly, free food and oil. He was essentially using the threat of a nuclear apocalypse to extract resources. Pay attention to this word, leverage. In English, leverage is the power to deeply influence a person or a situation, to get exactly what you want. Because North Korea had no economic power and no valuable exports, the threat of building a nuclear bomb became its only real diplomatic leverage. The 1994 nuclear deal was supposed to remove that leverage. But while Kim Jong-il publicly accepted the free shipments of foreign oil, evidence suggests his scientists secretly opened a second, completely hidden pathway to a bomb. They began acquiring the technology to highly enrich uranium, a different method, for creating a nuclear explosion that was much easier to hide in deep underground caves. By 1998, North Korea decided to shock the world again. Without any warning, they fired a massive, multi-stage ballistic missile directly over the islands of Japan. It fell into the Pacific Ocean, but the message was deafeningly clear. We are building rockets, and one day, they will be able to reach your cities. In the early 2000s, the carefully constructed illusion of peace finally shattered. A new American administration, led by President George W. Bush, confronted North Korean diplomats with undeniable intelligence about the secret uranium program. The old nuclear deal violently collapsed. North Korea expelled all international weapons inspectors, disabled the monitoring cameras, and rapidly restarted its nuclear reactors. Tensions skyrocketed. The world demanded that North Korea return to the negotiating table. High-level meetings were proposed to calm the situation. Listen for this word, summit. A summit is a highly formal, high-level meeting between the top leaders or heads of state of two or more governments. For years, international diplomats attempted to organize a summit to stop the North Korean nuclear program. 6 different nations, including China, Russia, Japan, South Korea, and the United States, sat down with North Korea to find a peaceful solution. It was a brilliant, terrifying stall tactic. Kim Jong-il sent his diplomats to these meetings to smile, argue, and endlessly delay the process, all while his scientists worked frantically in the dark. He was buying time. We have seen how North Korea mastered the dangerous art of brinkmanship using a broken nuclear deal to buy critical years of survival while pretending to disarm. The isolated nation acted like a venomous creature, using extreme threats as its only leverage against a vastly superior world. But a threat is only a threat until it is finally proven real. What happens to a hidden, starving kingdom on the day the ground actually shakes? And how does the global community react when the absolute worst-case scenario suddenly erupts from beneath a mountain? It is October 9th, 2006. Deep inside a solid granite mountain in the remote northeast, the earth violently fractures. Seismographs, delicate scientific instruments used to measure earthquakes, suddenly spike in South Korea, Japan, and the United States. The needles swing wildly across the paper. But this is no natural disaster. It is a deliberate, man-made tremor. After years of diplomatic delays, broken promises, and endless political theater, North Korea has successfully detonated its first nuclear device. The absolute worst-case scenario is no longer a theoretical threat. It is a terrifying, undeniable reality. Listen for this specific word: seismic. In English, the word seismic directly relates to earthquakes, or the violent vibrations of the earth. But in historical and political English, a seismic shift means a massive, sudden, and profound change in a global situation. The nuclear test of 2006 caused a massive seismic shift in international diplomacy. The era of the hopeful nuclear deal was officially dead. Any naive hope for a peaceful summit between friendly leaders vanished in the radioactive dust of that underground explosion. The United Nations Security Council, furious and deeply alarmed, immediately voted to punish the isolated regime. They did not use military force, fearing a catastrophic war that would destroy the densely populated South Korean capital of Seoul. Instead, they decided to use the global economy as a silent, suffocating weapon. Pay attention to this crucial term: sanctions. Sanctions are strict official orders, such as stopping trade, halting shipping, or freezing international bank accounts, taken against a country in order to force it to obey international law. The United Nations imposed incredibly severe sanctions on North Korea. They banned the sale of luxury goods, heavy military weapons, and critical industrial technology. The ultimate goal was to financially choke the regime until it surrendered its newly built nuclear weapons. Notice this word: pariah. A pariah is a person or an entire nation that is completely rejected, despised, and avoided by the rest of the civilized world. Overnight, North Korea officially became a global pariah. Think of a human body suffering from a highly contagious infected wound. The immune system attempts to build a thick, physical wall of tough cells around the infection to stop it from spreading to the rest of the healthy body. The global community tried to build a strict financial and diplomatic wall around North Korea to contain the nuclear contagion. But remember the founding ideology of Juche: the absolute demand for pure self-reliance. The regime had spent over 50 years preparing its citizens for exactly this kind of extreme isolation. The international sanctions deeply hurt the ordinary people, making essential food, electricity, and basic medicine even more scarce in the cold countryside. But the ruling elite survived. They bypassed the global financial system by utilizing vast, hidden criminal networks. They engaged in illegal ship-to-ship transfers of coal and oil in the middle of the dark ocean. And they began training thousands of elite computer hackers to steal hard currency directly from foreign banks. Just as the nation was adjusting to this harsh new reality of total global rejection, an entirely different kind of crisis struck the regime. This time, it was not an atomic bomb, but biology. In the late summer of 2008, the unpredictable leader, Kim Jong-il, suddenly disappeared from public view. He missed a highly choreographed major military parade in Pyongyang. Rumors swirled in the intelligence agencies of Seoul and Washington. Evidence strongly suggests that the aging dictator had suffered a massive, debilitating stroke. An empire built entirely on the shoulders of one man is incredibly fragile. A stroke occurs when blood flow to the brain is suddenly cut off. In a heavily centralized dictatorship, the supreme leader is the absolute brain of the state. If the leader's mind fails, the entire system risks total, immediate collapse. Kim Jong-il survived the medical emergency, but he was visibly weakened. In later photographs, his left arm hung limply at his side. He realized with terrifying clarity that he was running out of time. He needed an heir, and he needed one immediately. This brings us to the important historical word, succession. In royal or political English, succession is the formal process of inheriting a title, an office, or absolute power from the previous ruler. Kim Jong-il had to organize a rapid, incredibly rushed succession. He bypassed his older sons, who were deemed unfit to rule, and chose his youngest son, a 20-something man named Kim Jong-un. At the time, Kim Jong-un was completely unknown to his own people. He had been educated quietly in Switzerland under a false name, far away from the brutal politics of Pyongyang. To the outside world, this young man was a total mystery. He had absolutely no military experience, no political base, and no history of leadership. Yet, the massive state propaganda machine immediately went into overdrive. They desperately needed to build him up as a brilliant military genius, deeply connected to the sacred, founding bloodline of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung. We have seen how North Korea crossed the ultimate red line, detonating a nuclear weapon and turning itself into a heavily sanctioned international pariah. We have seen how the world responded with a suffocating economic wall, and how the failing health of an aging dictator forced a rushed, highly unstable transfer of power to an unknown young man. In December 2011, the old dictator finally died, and the young son was placed on the throne of a nuclear-armed, starving kingdom. The world watched with bated breath. Would this young, inexperienced, Swiss-educated son be quickly overthrown by the powerful, battle-hardened military generals surrounding him? Or would he unleash an entirely new, modern era of absolute terror to prove his strength to the world? Snow falls heavily on the quiet streets of Pyongyang in December 2011. A long black hearse slowly carries the body of the dictator through the freezing city. Walking right beside the front tire of the vehicle is a heavy-set young man in his late 20s, weeping openly in the bitter cold. This is Kim Jong-un. Right behind him march 7 elderly, highly decorated military generals. To foreign intelligence analysts watching the satellite feeds, the message seems incredibly obvious. They believe the young, untested boy is merely a temporary figurehead. They assume the old men with chests full of medals are the ones actually in control. They were completely wrong. When a new apex predator enters a highly competitive ecosystem, it must immediately eliminate any potential rivals, or it will not survive. The secretive political ecosystem of North Korea operates on the exact same brutal logic. Listen for this word, consolidate. In political English, to consolidate power means to gather all control into one place, making your position stronger, more solid, and much more difficult for enemies to attack. Kim Jong-un did not wait for the old generals to guide him. He moved with a speed and ruthlessness that shocked the international community. Over the next few years, those 7 powerful men who walked beside the hearse slowly began to disappear from public view. Pay attention to this historical term, purge. A purge is the sudden, often violent removal of a group of people from an organization or government because they are considered a threat to the leader. Evidence suggests the young leader ordered a series of brutal purges, targeting anyone who might question his absolute authority. The climax came in late 2013, when he had his own powerful uncle, publicly arrested by armed guards during a live government meeting. The uncle was executed shortly after. The message to the ruling elites was terrifyingly clear. Absolute loyalty is the only way to survive. Having successfully consolidated his throne, Kim turned his full attention to his ultimate shield. He knew the foundational ideology of Juche required complete military self-reliance. To protect his regime forever, he needed to finish what his father and grandfather had started. He needed a nuclear weapon that could directly strike the mainland of his greatest enemy, the United States. Notice this complex phrase, intercontinental ballistic missile, often abbreviated as ICBM. In military English, an ICBM is a massive, incredibly powerful rocket designed to travel into space and across the globe, moving a nuclear weapon from one continent to another. Under his father, rocket tests often ended in embarrassing failures, exploding right on the launch pad. But Kim Jong-un poured the remaining wealth of his heavily sanctioned nation directly into the science program. He attended the launches himself, casually smoking cigarettes next to massive, highly explosive, liquid-fueled rockets. He rewarded his scientists with luxury apartments and intense public praise. The pace of the testing became absolutely furious. Listen for this word. Unprecedented. When an event is unprecedented, it means it has never been done or experienced before in all of recorded history. The speed of North Korea's weapon development under the young leader was completely unprecedented. In the summer and fall of 2017, the Earth shook repeatedly. North Korea detonated a hydrogen bomb, an explosive device vastly more powerful than their previous atomic tests. Shortly after, they launched a massive ICBM high into the dark of space. When the rocket re-entered the atmosphere and fell into the sea, scientists around the world quickly calculated its trajectory. The mathematical truth was undeniable. The isolated, struggling nation had finally built a missile that could reach Washington, D.C. Think of a human body fighting a severe, high-grade fever. The temperature spikes to a dangerous, life-threatening peak, and the body begins to shake. In 2017, the political fever on the Korean peninsula reached its absolute peak. The United States government threatened North Korea with total destruction. The leaders exchanged furious, highly personal insults over global media. The old hopes for a diplomatic, peaceful nuclear deal seemed completely dead. The world held its breath, deeply afraid that a catastrophic war was only a single mistake away. But sometimes, just when a biological fever seems about to destroy the host, the temperature suddenly breaks, and a strange, quiet calm follows. In early 2018, just when the heat reached its boiling point, Kim Jong-un executed a brilliant, shocking maneuver. He declared his nuclear arsenal officially complete. He abruptly paused the missile testing. And suddenly, he offered to do something his father and grandfather had never, ever done. He offered to sit down, face to face, with the President of the United States. We have seen how a young, completely underestimated son brutally consolidated his power, purged his powerful rivals, and pushed his isolated nation to the very brink of nuclear war. He proved to the world that his terrifying weapons were real, forcing the global empires to take him seriously. But what happens when the absolute ruler of a secretive, isolated state actually steps out of the shadows and walks across the border? And how does the world react when the most dangerous standoff in modern history suddenly transforms into a highly televised global summit. A heavy, breathless hush falls over a luxury hotel lobby on the tropical island of Singapore. It is the morning of June 12, 2018. Two men, representing nations that have been technically at war for over 60 years, walk toward each other across a vibrant red carpet and extend their hands. The flashbulbs of 1,000 international cameras erupt like lightning. On the left stands the President of the United States. On the right stands Kim Jong-un. With a single handshake, the young, isolated dictator achieves something his father and his grandfather only dreamed of. He is standing shoulder to shoulder with the leader of the free world, not as a defeated enemy, but as an equal. Listen for this word: legitimacy. In political English, legitimacy is the officially recognized legal right to rule and to be treated with respect by other nations. By securing this unprecedented global summit, Kim Jong-un gained massive international legitimacy. He proved to his people back home that the world finally feared and respected their power. For a brief, shining moment, the world truly believed a historic breakthrough was happening. The two leaders smiled, shared private meals, and signed a formal, albeit brief, document. The terrifying fever of 2017 seemed to have broken. The United States demanded that North Korea dismantle its weapons, while North Korea demanded severe economic sanctions be lifted. To finalize this massive negotiation, a second, highly anticipated summit was scheduled for February 2019, this time in the bustling city of Hanoi, Vietnam. But a smile on a red carpet does not erase decades of deep, structural paranoia. Notice this crucial term: impasse. An impasse is a frustrating situation in a negotiation where absolutely no progress is possible, usually because of a fundamental, unresolvable disagreement. The Hanoi summit ended in a sudden, shocking impasse. The United States insisted on a comprehensive, airtight nuclear deal, demanding that Kim surrender every single weapon and hidden laboratory before any financial relief was given. But Kim Jong-un, remembering the fate of other dictators who gave up their weapons and later lost their regimes, refused to expose his nation's ultimate shield. He demanded the immediate lifting of economic sanctions first. Neither side would blink. The meetings were abruptly canceled. The grand diplomatic theater collapsed. Kim Jong-un boarded his dark green, heavily armored train and began the long, quiet journey back through China to his isolated kingdom. He returned entirely empty-handed. Then, exactly as the diplomatic doors slammed shut, a very real biological threat swept across the globe. In early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic erupted. While the rest of the world struggled to adapt, the North Korean regime reacted with a terrifying, familiar reflex. Think of a clam suddenly snapping its thick shell shut when a shadow passes over it. The regime instantly used the microscopic virus as the ultimate justification to seal its borders completely. They did not just stop tourists, they stopped international trade, foreign diplomats, and the vital, quiet flow of the black market that ordinary citizens relied upon to survive. The state ordered its border guards to shoot anyone attempting to cross into China. This brings us to a final, essential phrase: status quo. The status quo refers to the existing current state of affairs, especially regarding social or political issues. Before the pandemic, the status quo in North Korea involved turning a blind eye to illegal smuggling because the government could not feed its people. But under the absolute lockdown, the regime ruthlessly crushed those markets, bringing the population back under strict, centralized control. The guiding philosophy of Juche, the demand for total, uncompromising self-reliance, was pushed to its absolute, literal extreme. The nation cut itself off from the human race more completely than at any time since the Korean War. Today, if you look at a nighttime satellite image of the Korean peninsula from outer space, the tragic reality of this history is written in light and darkness. In the south, the Republic of Korea is a blazing, brilliant island of modern electricity, a testament to a society deeply connected to the global economy. But just above the 38th parallel, the land abruptly goes pitch black. It is a dark, silent void, a kingdom frozen in time by the trauma of war, the grip of an absolute dynasty, and the cold logic of nuclear survival. We have traveled from the sudden, joyful liberation of a colonized people to the arbitrary stroke of a pen that tore a nation in half. We have seen how a devastating war burned a society to ashes, and how a ruling family used that trauma to forge a completely isolated, militarized state. We witnessed the tragic human cost of famine, the dangerous game of atomic brinkmanship, and the dazzling, ultimately hollow spectacle of modern diplomacy. The arbitrary line drawn by two tired officers in 1945 was supposed to be a temporary boundary, but history is rarely temporary. Today, the border remains the most heavily armed, dangerous frontier on Earth, and behind it, 25 million people continue to live in the dark, waiting for a final chapter that remains unwritten.